increasingly depoliticizing regulatory decision making, subjecting it to further impact assessment, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to talk about today is the fourth chapter in the book, which sort of says that despite these intentions to depoliticize regulatory decision making, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, what you've had in TTIP is the opposite. You've had a massive repoliticization of trade because you've had civil society groups really campaigning quite strongly against this agreement for a variety of different reasons. And what I wanted to do in today's presentation and paper is talk a little bit about why that is and how they've been successful at doing so. Which is of course not to say that TTIP is dead, but I think the groups have been very successful at putting at least the advocates on the defensive. So, in doing so, in a sense, what I want to do is bring in the role of language and ideas into the study of trade politics, as well as the role of civil society. And these are two issues that, if you look at the presentations today and yesterday, have been talked about a little bit less. And that's, I guess, because, the sort of conventional approach to studying trade policies is focused on, the competition between various forms of interest groups, exporters, importers, import-dependent firms increasingly as well. And, in a way, this was about distributive conflict, right? Who got what, who benefits from trade liberalization and so forth and so on. And in a way, this works, when you're looking at the sort of embedded liberal period of trade liberalization, insofar as, under the original GATT, the GATT was largely concerned without the border measures. It was largely concerned with, eliminating tariffs. And so, of course, the effects of eliminating tariffs are largely distributive. Of course, and I'll talk about this in a second very briefly, but the trade regime has increasingly become more intrusive insofar as it's started talking about what are called behind the border measures, right? So I won't bore you with the details, but of course, with the euro going around, you have the expansion of the trade agenda to cover things like services, intellectual property rights, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, et cetera, et cetera. And this expansion and extension of the trade agenda, of course, meant that there was increasing, or in response to that, there was increasing contestation from civil society groups in various aspects of the trade and investment architecture, right? So, we've got and I'm not saying it's just because of the expansion of the trade agenda, but, this is an important part of it. So you, of course, have the big campaign against the multilateral agreement on investment, the idea that this was going to become a corporate rule treaty because of its provisions on investor-state dispute settlement. You have, the famous battle in Seattle. The tuna dolphin case in the early 90s was one that also raised, eyebrows and quite a lot of controversy, particularly in the United States. And the way in which this is increasingly the way in which this was often conceptualized, this sort of civil society activism in the late 90s, early 2000s, is in terms of transnational advocacy networks, and this is a term that Keck and Sicking brought in. And they refer to, a limited group of individuals, but an important group of individuals who are driven by principled beliefs and values in their work rather than economic incentives, right? So it's sort of a common definition of civil society groups. And these groups, despite the fact that they weren't, transnational social movements, because they were rather more limited in scope, they were able to influence policy because they were able to shape and discursively frame, particular issues. So, for example, in the campaign against the multilateral agreement on investment, the frame was that, actually these investment protections and multilateralizing these investment protections would give corporations extra rights, right? So it was a, in quotation marks, corporate rule treaty. And that frame, of course, was somewhat successful in at least putting the advocates of Mai on the defensive. And of course, Mai collapsed for a variety of reasons, but I think civil society activism was an important factor. And so what we do in this chapter, in a way, is sort of, try and see trade conflict, or the conflict around TTIP in particular, not as a traditional sort of distributive trade conflict about which, whether exporters win, importers win, because in a sense, partly because of, we talked about this a lot, the increasing integration of firms into global value chains, the distinction between exporter and importer is sort of breaking down, and there is a, greater consensus among firms about, the desirability of trade liberalization. But also because the nature of TTIP in particular is such that, it's tariffs and market access issues, although part of it are not what the game's at, as it were. It's largely about regulatory issues, and fairly deep regulatory issues that, it goes much beyond what the WTO has accomplished. And we refer to that as normative trade conflict insofar as, it's not about distribution of goodies, it's about, of course, distributive questions are still important, but, it's more about, well, what are the values? How should we regulate particular risks? How should we regulate, consumer safety? How should we regulate, public health, social and labor standards, etc.? So, it's normative rather than distributive. And this, of course, poses a number of challenges for decision makers, particularly when they try and defend trade liberalization on the basis of sort of economic arguments. But we'll get into that in a second. So, I won't bore you with this too much, other than to say that, of course, TTIP is very significant insofar as it follows a decade of stagnation in the multilateral system. And so, of course, you know, for TTIP in a lot of ways is a way of bringing forward the trade agenda and debating a lot of issues that have sort of, you know, stagnated, or where negotiations have stagnated at the multilateral level, particularly behind the border issues. And in particular, what TTIP is about, I mean, this is the issue of investor-to-state dispute settlement has gained a lot of attention, but, you know, in a way is secondary to the whole regulatory convergence or cooperation element. And this is all about, well, I guess it's about two things. It's about having specific chapters, you know, that have sectoral, you know, for particular sectors, so on pharmaceuticals, on motor vehicles, on chemicals, having particular discussions about, you know, how EU and US rules and regulations and standards can be brought closer in particular sectors. But those negotiations aren't moving as fast as people want, so a lot of emphasis is particularly put on what's called a horizontal regulatory cooperation chapter. And the idea here is to establish and institutionalize processes for further regulatory cooperation. And I could sort of briefly outline what the issue is here. The issue is here that, that you know, this would you know, impact on regulatory processes in the EU in particular, because most of the civil society opposition has been in the EU. But I'll touch upon the importance of that a little bit more when I talk about the different civil society groups. But the other thing, of course, is investor-to-state dispute settlement, and this comes in the context of the provisions on investor protection in the agreement, and essentially what it means is that investors would, you know, depending on how the provisions are worded, have access to independent arbitration tribunals if they feel that their investor rights are compromised. So, just to give you an overview, the level of opposition to TTIP from civil society, which sort of started kicking off from the get-go of the negotiations in July 2013, was sort of caught policymakers in the EU by surprise. A lot of it has, I should say, been concentrated in the EU. And part of the reason for that, or a big reason for that, is that, you know, in the US the debate is very much centered on TPP. And the result of this, I mean, you know, it's interesting how there has been this sort of a noticeable impact on the negotiations. So a lot of the criticism was centered on ISDS, so, you know, negotiations on that provision have been, or on investor protection in general, have been suspended since January of 2014. And in response, the EU set up a consultation which, you know, received a massive number of responses. After not featuring at all in an EP resolution, or very little, in an EP resolution on TTIP in 2013, the issue of ISDS has meant that the European Parliament has not been able to vote on a resolution, so the vote on that has been postponed, largely because of divisions within the Social Democratic Group. And then, very interestingly, there's a European Citizens Initiative, which is a sort of form of pan-European petition, which has garnered over 2.2 million signatories and counting, which is sort of, I think, you know, one of the largest number of signatories. I think it's only one of 4 ECIs that's ever reached the threshold, which is 1 million signatories, and it's actually been rejected officially by the Commission on the grounds that, you know, it's not directly tackling a legislative act, it's calling for the repeal of the negotiating mandate, which of course is not a legal act. But there we go. So, I guess this is the meat of it. What these groups have been particularly, and these various civil society groups within Europe, and I can talk a little bit more about what groups in a second, but what they've been very successful at doing is, you know, moving away from the narrative that advocates of the agreement have had, that this is good for growth and jobs, you know, that this is a form of economic leadership, you know, particularly vis-a-vis China. And they've been able to frame it, you know, at least in public discourse in a lot of places, particularly in Germany and the UK, as a threat to democracy and levels of social and environmental protection. And of course there's, you know, criticism of, you know, I would say practically all of the provisions in TTIP, but you know, if I had to distill it down to 3 lines of criticism, it would be these. One is the idea that, and this is very important because ISDS has sort of become a focal point for opposition, one is the idea that this is a form of corporate rule giving corporations special rights. A second is that, you know, this idea that there's going to be regulatory cooperation both through the sectoral chapters and the horizontal chapter. This will lead to a race to the bottom, as, you know, trade is increasingly viewed as regulation is increasingly viewed as an irritant to trade, and therefore, you know, regulation has to be, or, you know, red tape has to be cut. And people talk in particular about the living agreement, where there's procedures in place to further institutionalize regulatory processes that assess regulatory decision making on the basis of its impact on transatlantic trade. And then another big issue has been the, the lack of transparency that's been highlighted. And actually, it's quite interesting in response to this. Yeah, the EU has been, opened or offered more transparency than ever before. Arguably, you could argue whether that's enough or not, but it's also been a consistent line of criticism. And the EU has very much responded to it. The United States less so, but it's interesting. So what I would say is one of our sort of take-home points from this is that actually dealing with this sort of normative criticism of trade liberalization and trade agreements is difficult because it really touches on sort of core values and emotions, and so far the Commission's response has been somewhat technocratic and economistic. So on the ISDS issue, it's essentially gone for a reform of the system, but keeping the basic principle of investor arbitration there. And this, of course, is very difficult to sell because the opposition from groups, both sort of what we would call anti-globalization groups, but also, organizations like the Consumers Bureau, which is sort of quite mainstream, they're opposed to it on principle. It's very difficult to reform a system that, is being labeled as fundamentally flawed. The idea that standards won't be diluted seem to have little traction. There's little trust in the Commission, partly because of the lack of transparency, but also because business is seen as having a privileged input into the negotiations. And in the past, business input was seen as a way of legitimating trade liberalization, but here it seems to be having the opposite effect, right? So I think in the book chapter we talk about how this is like the bicycle theory in reverse. And then this whole idea of a new transparency initiative is unlikely to satisfy opponents, A, because there's no release of the consolidated text, which is what opponents are calling for, and B, because it seems to be framed as a sort of PR initiative, right? So it's about educating people about how their sort of concerns are not relevant because look at the text, it doesn't say that. So there seems to be a sort of element there of seeing this as a PR initiative, which is problematic. So to sum up, and I know I'm out of time. Obviously, too early to tell what the effect will be on TTIP, but I would argue that the advocates of this agreement are increasingly on the defensive, and it's difficult for them, in the context of a deeply politicized set of negotiations, framed in a very normative way, to contest those norms. And the question, of course, for me, looking forward and trying to develop this into a broader project is, well, first of all, how long-lasting will this mobilization be? Will it fizzle out as it did in the 1990s and early 2000s? I mean, I exaggerate when I say fizzled out, but obviously trade didn't have the profile it did for the entirety of the 2000s. And second of all, how does this compare to civil society mobilization on other issues like finance, where actually there hasn't really been as successful a contestation. I mean, I guess austerity is the other example, and that, of course, that conflict this week is being played out quite heavily. But this seems to be, much more effective a contestation than, in the case of global finance and macroeconomic policy. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And those issues about democracy segue very nicely to our next presentation.